White initiates with the king's pawn opening, aiming for central control and open lines. A solid start. Black responds symmetrically with the Sicilian defense, creating an unbalanced position and fighting for central space. White develops a knight to a central square, reinforcing pawn control and preparing for further development. Black mirrors White's knight development, contesting central influence and maintaining dynamic balance. White opts for a fianchetto setup with this move, while thematic, slightly reduces White's central initiative. Black mirrors the fianchetto with placing the bishop on a long diagonal and maintaining equality. White develops the bishop too, completing the fianchetto and preparing to castle. A stable development. Black places the bishop on, completing their fianchetto. Both sides are developing harmoniously. White supports central pawns with this solidifies the structure but slightly limits the dark-squared bishop. Black mirrors with strengthening the center and preparing for piece development. White develops another knight too, aiming to reroute it to a more active square. Black develops the rook too, eyeing the queenside and preparing for pawn advances. White plays, potentially preparing queenside expansion or preventing Black's counterplay. Black moves the knight too. This is an awkward square and a strategic misstep, losing tempo. White castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the rooks. A standard and safe move. Black castles kingside as well, prioritizing king safety and completing development. White plays, a prophylactic move preventing potential knight outposts on. Black advances the f-pawn too, challenging White's central structure and opening lines. White develops the bishop too, controlling central squares and supporting potential kingside play. Black centralizes the knight too, placing it on an active outpost and creating threats. White moves the queen too, connecting the rooks and preparing for potential action. Black repositions the knight too, potentially preparing to reroute it or defend the kingside. White advances the f-pawn too, strengthening the center and opening lines for the bishop. Black develops the bishop too, preparing to challenge White's light-squared bishop or support d-pawn. White moves the king too, a common king safety maneuver in fianchetto structures. Black repositions the bishop too, aiming to trade off White's light-squared bishop. White moves the rook too, activating it on the semi-open file and pressuring Black's queenside. Black plays, potentially preparing queenside counterplay but weakening their pawn structure. White moves the bishop back too, a retreat that simplifies the position but loses initiative. Black centralizes the queen too, improving its position and preparing for exchanges. White captures the pawn on, opening the center and developing pieces actively. Black recaptures with the c-pawn, opening the c-file and maintaining central tension. White retreats the knight too, a passive move that relinquishes central control. Black pushes the e-pawn too, gaining space in the center and opening lines. White reinforces the pawn chain with aiming for a solid pawn structure. Black captures the pawn on, breaking White's pawn structure and opening diagonals. White recaptures with the knight, maintaining a solid central presence. Black captures the pawn on, opening the kingside and creating dynamic imbalances. White recaptures with the g-pawn, opening the g-file for the rook and creating an isolated pawn. Black pushes the b-pawn too, aiming to expand on the queenside. White captures the pawn on. This captures material but opens the kingside and gives Black counterplay. Black recaptures with the bishop too. This improves Black's bishop but opens lines for White. White recaptures the bishop, centralizing the queen and gaining control of open files. Black recaptures the pawn on, recovering material and activating their queen. White captures the pawn on, creating an advanced passed pawn but simplifying the position. Black plays a passive rook move. This allows white to seize the initiative with a strong threat. White advances the b-pawn too, creating a strong passed pawn and restricting black's pieces. Black plays a pawn sacrifice that opens lines but doesn't solve their positional issues. White captures the pawn on, winning material and consolidating their advantage. Black pushes the d-pawn too, a desperate attempt to gain counterplay. White advances the b-pawn too, creating a strong passed pawn and controlling more space. Black plays a passive move that allows white to further strengthen their position. White moves the knight too, attacking key squares and increasing pressure on black. Black plays a surprising move that allows white to win material and gain a decisive advantage. White plays a positional mistake that allows black to maintain some resistance. Black plays a reckless rook sacrifice that unfortunately falls into white's trap. White moves the king to a safe retreat that consolidates their overwhelming advantage. Black repositions the knight to, activating it and defending important squares. White reroutes the rook to, preparing to exploit the open file and press the advantage. Black exchanges rooks, simplifying the position to reduce white's attacking chances. White recaptures the rook, maintaining the pressure and a decisive advantage. Black moves the rook to, activating it and threatening white's pawn structure. White advances the b-pawn too, creating a dangerous passed pawn that is difficult to stop. Black captures the pawn on, a minor inaccuracy that doesn't alter the game's outcome. White captures the pawn on, consolidating their material advantage and simplifying. Black recaptures with the g-pawn, opening lines and trying to create counterplay. White moves the rook to, preparing to deliver checkmate or win more material. Black captures the pawn on, a desperate attempt to gain some compensation. White delivers check with, forcing the black king into a precarious position. Black moves the king to, trying to escape the immediate threats. White maneuvers the rook to, tightening the net around the black king. Black captures the rook on, a final attempt to create complications. White captures the rook with check, forcing the black king further into trouble. Black moves the king to, seeking safety but facing overwhelming pressure. White moves the king to, repositioning for the final phase of the game. Black moves the rook to, a desperate attempt to create any counterplay. White develops the bishop to, completing the attack and preparing for a swift conclusion.